File into the bunker and take your seats. The broadcast is about to begin. From Fort Bragg, North Carolina, this is the Doomsday Clock. Stories from the brink of Armageddon. Brought to you by the 18th Airborne Corps.
Hey there, I am Christal Crawford, one of the two co-hosts of the Doomsday Clock.
And I am Joe Buccino, the other co-host.
And this is a brand new podcast organized, created, and produced entirely by the two of us with the official backing of the 18th Airborne Corps.
And if you don't know, the 18th Airborne Corps is an Army command with forces spread out all throughout the country. The 18th Airborne has a unique mission: rapidly respond to a crisis anywhere in the world at any time.
Yeah, Joe, and the 18th is an enormous force. It's a huge force mix of tanks, rotary wing aircraft, air assault, airborne, light infantry, mechanized infantry, sappers, basically the entire spectrum of American land power.
And just to be clear, you said they do have airborne.
Yes, they do.
All right. Well, this podcast is not really about the 18th Airborne Corps in its current configuration. Rather, it's about the history of the 18th Airborne Corps.
And not so much the history writ large as the history of a very specific period.
Yeah, this is about the Cold War history of the 18th Airborne.
Over the course of this podcast, we'll cover the period between the close of World War II in 1945 and the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. This is a uniquely American story, and it's a story told from the perspective of one American unit.
And this is an unscripted discussion every Tuesday. Each episode covers a unique story from our Cold War history. So think of this, if you're listening to this, think of this as an ongoing conversation in which you are participating about a fascinating period of Americana.
So why this period? Why the Cold War? Well, really it's a period that is ripe for examination. This is a time of paranoia, of terror, and of naked patriotism.
Some of the stories from this period are so bizarre it's almost humorous. And the view of the world from Fort Bragg during this period offers a very interesting snapshot into how the country tried to resolve an existential fear that the Soviet Union would incinerate major American cities with nuclear missiles.
This was a time when humanity teetered on the edge. We had the bomb, the Soviets had the bomb. We considered ourselves a God-fearing nation, a good God-fearing nation, and the Soviets were evil and godless. We were the light and they were dark.
And in that sense, Christal, it was a much simpler time for the country.
That's right. When you think about how divided we are now, how fractured our politics, our beliefs, even our understanding of basic truths, the Cold War, particularly the early Cold War, was a great contrast. We were unified in our fear. We were unified against our common enemy.
That's so true, but it was a simpler time, but it wasn't necessarily a more innocent time. We were often unified against the wrong things. This was a time, we should point out, Christal, that the country was very racially segregated. This was a time where there were limited opportunities for women. The nation publicly scorned homosexuals as subversive and therefore possibly communist agents. Suspected commies were rooted out of public life with no trial, with no evidence. We should add that little bit of disclaimer in that things were simpler, but the country wasn't purer, and we have progressed in many ways since.
That's right, Joe. There are parts of that period that stand as dark stains on American history, and we'll shine a light on those during this podcast. So, Joe, let's talk a little bit about the roles and the conduct of the show.
Sure. I think it's pretty basic. There's only two of us, right?
Right. We are co-hosts, and we both run the show.
And we are both amateur historians.
I'd say we are students of history.
Yeah, that's probably a better way of describing it, but we'll have some actual historians on as guests.
Indeed we will, and these folks are people who can provide some real meat in terms of context, time, place, sourcing, and the like.
That's right. And so, we should probably explain for the uninformed the title of the podcast.
Sure, the Doomsday Clock. So the Doomsday Clock, of course, is not an actual clock, but a symbol.
That's right. It was created in 1947 during the Truman administration. And by the way, Harry Truman, the president at the start of the Cold War, is a recurring character, will be a recurring character in this program. But the Doomsday Clock was created in 1947 by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. That is a non-profit organization of, atomic scientists.
And 1947, of course, is right at the start of the nuclear arms race.
That's right. The Doomsday Clock was started at a time when the world stood on the brink of nuclear war. the world sat at the feet of two global superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, as you have pointed out. Both had the atomic bomb, a weapon capable of destroying all of civilization. This was a time, Christal, when many national security strategists in this country felt that the United States and the Soviet Union could not peacefully coexist. So you think about where we were. World War II had ended. Out of it emerged two real winners, one capitalist, one socialist. The Soviets' ever-present aim was to advance the socialist cause. For the Soviets, capitalism was a menace to the ideals of socialism, and capitalists could not be trusted or allowed to influence the Soviet people. In the United States, this was a time of great fear of Soviet expansion. So the clock was a symbol for its time. It was a metaphor for the existential threat to humanity from unchecked scientific and technical advances. And so the editors of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists created the design for the June 1947 edition. It's not a forecasting tool, it never has been, and it's not really a prediction. It's more of a warning.
And it represents how close the world is to midnight.
Midnight being global catastrophe.
So where we are on the clock represents how close the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists and Security Board thinks we are to an apocalyptic event. How many minutes we are to midnight represents how close we are to the end of the world.
Yeah, now most people associate the Doomsday Clock with atomic annihilation.
But other global events, climate change for example, also can move the clock closer to midnight.
That's right, and it also, time doesn't work in a linear fashion with the Doomsday Clock, so time goes forward as conditions become more dangerous, and time can move backwards, counterclockwise, so the clock has actually moved counterclockwise after the end of the Cold War, as conditions become more safe, as conditions become safer, at least in the eyes of this group of scientists.
So the Doomsday Clock sounds cartoonish, but it is very real.
That's right. It's a real thing. It exists. It lives now on the internet, on the homepage for the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists.
There is no physical Doomsday Clock.
That's right. Yeah, there is no. You can't go to see this somewhere in the country. You can only go online. So it used to be printed. It was initially printed on the cover of the Bulletin, initially in 1947, and it was printed on the cover of the Bulletin with every update. This, of course, is when people read magazines through hard cover magazines. Now it sits on their website.
And we have never been this close to the edge. That is really a grim thought.
Even during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when we were very close to a nuclear war, we have never been this close. The clock's original setting in 1947 was 7 minutes to midnight. That was really, there was no mathematical equation that led to that. It was really supposed to be a stark warning to the world and really to the United States. It's been set backward and forward 24 times since then. Now, the largest ever number of minutes to midnight was 17. So in 1991, as I alluded to, at the end of the Cold War, we went all the way back to 17 minutes to midnight. The closest we've ever been to midnight, as you said, Christal, is right now 100 seconds, 1 minute and 40 seconds. In January 2020, the clock was set to 100 seconds to midnight.
And that's due in part to climate change and the effects on the environment.
That's right. We are 100 seconds away. So according to this group, humanity continues to face two simultaneous existential dangers: nuclear war and climate change. These are compounded by a threat multiplier, cyber-enabled information warfare that undercuts society's ability to respond to things. We can move much faster now on a tragic miscalculation than we could in 1947. We can communicate faster, we can pass information faster, we can send military forces faster, and so we are, as a result, closer to midnight. The international security situation is dire, not just because of climate change and the threat of nuclear war, but because world leaders have allowed the international political infrastructure for managing them to erode. We'll talk about the infrastructure that was established to allow leaders to talk, to call one another, to step back from the brink, and a lot of that infrastructure is gone now, and so that's really where we come from. 100 seconds to midnight. Increased threats to global stability and the possibility of a nuclear blunder, and all of that is exacerbated by the rate of climate change, and all of that is exacerbated by increased intra-state wars, food instability, water scarcity, the proliferation of the internet, the proliferation of cyber weapons, etc., etc. These things all compound on top of one another and increase the threat to civilization.
So speaking to the atomic scientists and the security board, do they offer any insight as to how we can step back and move the clock back to a more stable state of things?
So that is really not their role. They are natural scientists. They're pure scientists. They're not political scientists. So that they would leave the resolution of these threats to the political scientists who deal in the realm of the diplomatic.
So the Doomsday Clock, the title of this podcast, is a good way into the thinking about the start of the Cold War.
That's right, yeah. It's really a way of describing what we're going to be talking about, which was this really very threatening environment that the country lived through and that the 18th Airborne Corps stood on the edge of. And so, you and I, obviously, and the 18th Airborne Corps, are not taking a position on these things or on the Doomsday Clock. We're just describing it. But, you're right. It's the Doomsday Clock is a good way of thinking about the subject at hand, and, the threats that we are faced with, the threats that the 18th Airborne Corps serves as a hedge against. And if you think about it, Christal, all 7 billion of us crammed onto this planet, all on the knife's edge, all sweating, breathing, suffering, teetering closer and closer to the edge of annihilation, 100 seconds away.
So we'll leave you on that positive note.
Yeah, and we will pick it up next week with our first story about the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.